It is Friday, November 18th. Let's talk PlayStation. Alright everyone, welcome back. It's been a really weird, wild week for Twitter. Not so much for PlayStation, but as always, we have stories to go over. So first up, let's start with our PS Plus reminder. The November PS Plus Essential Games are still live, so if you haven't just yet, claim those, get that done. And also PS Plus Extra and Premium, those games are now live as well. Sorry if I'm a little raspy. I might have to clear my voice a few times. It's getting colder here in Western New York. Anyway, let's start with our first actual story, which is the PS5 Explore tab, which we should mention for those that don't know, or if you haven't noticed, which I think most have, is that the Explore tab is pretty much only in North America. As far as I'm aware, I don't know every single country, mind you, but the primary difference is Explore tab is in North America, everywhere else not so much. And it's more or less not really a useful screen. It just shows you advertisements more or less, where anytime you buy something or download something, that game is automatically followed, and that's where you can be delivered game news on the PS5 main home screen. It's not a huge deal, but again, something where it's not really that useful. What Sony's doing now, and a few folks sent me this throughout the week, and it seems like they're finally rolling it out to more people, so my PS5 just got this like maybe 30 minutes ago, which is a server-side change to making the Explore tab a lot more usable. So now you can see trophies, you can see what friends are online, and there is still official game news on there, which I think there's some merit to that. You just don't want it to be primarily game news and advertisements being thrown at you. But it would be very cool if this Explore tab became a lot more usable, and they also rolled it out to more countries where, it just put things in there that people want to see beyond advertisements. So I think this is a very good step in the right direction. Put some key info in there. I always found it very strange, actually, that, the social aspect of PS5 was completely hidden away behind the control center, right? So put friend info on there. I like the little trophy progress bar to the next level, which is very cool to see. And it'd be great if this was a lot more, it was updated over time and more robust to add, customizations, maybe some custom widgets that you want to mess around with. I think there's a lot of potential for that Explore tab, and I'm happy to see that after 2 years, they're finally doing something with it that makes sense. Next up, we recently found out for Spider-Man 2 that the actor who played or who voiced Harry Osborn is not going to reprise the role in the sequel, which was Scott Porter. So recently he confirmed this on Twitter in a now deleted tweet, which was screen capped on Reddit. He says, and I quote here, "While I voiced Harry in the first Spider-Man, I unfortunately will not be in the sequel. They decided to go photoreal, and the difference between me and Harry's ages was too much to overcome, I believe. I was bummed, but I get it. Gonna be an incredible game." Now, of course, mocap work, voice work, and the final character design, they aren't all exclusively tied to one another. So, even looking directly at Insomniac Games, where you've got Yuri Lowenthal's voice, but John Bubniak's likeness, and then swapping that appearance out for a new face in Spider-Man Remastered. These are very common practices, but something where I guess, or I would assume, Insomniac wants to either streamline the process, or maybe that's not the reason, and maybe they just had somebody else in mind that they wanted to put into this role. But I would imagine it's maybe a little bit of both, just only because it's an opportune time to do it, where Harry did not really play a big role in the first game. So if you want to kind of avoid another, face controversy, if you will, right, where that's a big change and one where fans are easily going to notice it and complain about it. If you want to avoid that, then you might as well do something like this now, where, in the context of Harry, he only showed up as a voice during some mainline missions, I think, and then also the side quest with the buildings on the science buildings on top of the high rises, and then there was a picture of him towards the end or something. I don't remember exactly, but essentially they weren't a front-facing, character that you were engaging with often, right? So not a huge deal. I just assume they want to streamline the process here for this character, not have to, kind of take things from here and there to create the character from the ground up like they have done and like other studios sometimes do. Now, getting into God of War Ragnarok, we'll talk about some sales data, which is always fun to go over. Sony used to do this where after major releases, not all of them, mind you, but, day one or 3 days or a week after, they would talk about a huge milestone that they would hit, and they don't really do that anymore. But thankfully, we do have the GfK boxed UK sales data, which GamesIndustry.biz does publish. And so this is physical copies only at retail, and that is the minority nowadays, so it's mostly digital. We don't have the full picture, but even off of that alone, we are hearing some very crazy good things, which is, this game had the biggest launch in the history of the franchise in the UK. It sold more copies in a single day than any other God of War game has done in its first week on the market, and overall for the first week, it was the UK's second biggest game launch of the year, beating Modern Warfare 2 and Elden Ring. And the number one debut instead was FIFA 23, but still, that was very impressive. Also, another interesting data point to bring up, which goes back to our video about PS5 adoption being insanely high during this cross-gen period, is that 82% of copies were sold for PS5, 12% on PS4. So heavily favoring PS5, which, not a shocker. Again, in that video, we talked about how cross-gen stuff, even during the first year, consumers are eager to buy new games, new consoles, and so even in that first year, they'll favor PS5, and so we saw a lot of that, and it only gets worse over time, of course. So yeah, heavily favoring PS5, not a surprise, but this game likely sold very well, easily millions right off the bat, and so it will be really interesting to see that first number that Sony decides to finally disclose, because I'm sure it's looking really good, and I would assume they're also very pleased with that number. Now, in other God of War news, they're still doing the press junket, so Cory Barlog and Eric Williams still doing interviews and talking about the launch, the game, what it was like, and one thing that came up with the LA Times was what comes next for the studio. They didn't reveal anything, obviously, but Cory does talk about what comes next, and he says the studio is currently working on a few different things, which is not exactly surprising, but also something where we can, theorize what that could be, and we are suspecting Cory does, in fact, have a new IP in the works, so that will be exciting to see someday. I'm not sure if that's going to be anytime soon, but Eric Williams also touched on doing more God of War, and how he specifically said doing more God of War would not necessarily be a bad thing or that it would be shameful. He was quoted saying, "I remember talking to someone from another game company where they were trying to get me to leave. They said, 'Do you just want to be known as the God of War guy for the rest of your life? That was your big pitch to dissuade me? Because yes, I kind of do.'" Pretty funny hearing that from Eric Williams, where he's pretty much touched most God of War games. Not sure if that includes the Ready at Dawn PSP games or the PS3 remasters, which he did have time away from Sony, so he was consulting and he was still working on some PlayStation properties during that time. But and that may or may not also include that pre-smartphone era mobile game, which I'm sure he likely did not, work on that. But the point is, I love how he wears this franchise on himself as a badge of honor, and he also brought up a very unique challenge that came up in development, which is that he learned he had aphantasia, which is an ailment that means you can't visualize things in your head. So you close your eyes and you can't picture things, more or less. And he didn't know that until he was making this game and trying to, I guess, work out with the creative team on what he wanted done, because his process involved using so many visual references. And so I guess that was a problem where you're trying to go back and forth and convey your thoughts, and you can't really do that without all these visual references. And so that came up where I guess some people on the team felt they were sort of losing their creative leeway because Eric was seen as micromanaging to a degree. But he then found out through the process, I have this thing that really doesn't allow me to process things like that in my head. So eventually he worked through that and found a way that eventually led to what was a good product. And that speaks volumes about the direction process and also this franchise, where it's had so many different directors. Cory Barlog is still the only one that has directed more than one God of War game. Pretty noteworthy for a franchise that's been this long running and has seen consistently good critical reception. Now, I do have one more God of War story to bring up, and I saw this and I thought, that is so cool, and also, I can't believe they did this. Not a spoiler, but it is kind of a cool cameo type Easter egg thing, so if you don't want to be spoiled on that, skip ahead, but there is a reference in this game to PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. So this was on Push Square. I did not see this myself yet in game, but it's something where Mimir will talk about this just naturally. I have no idea when this can be prompted, but he will ask Kratos or say something along the lines of, I heard you did a battle with beasts, scoundrels, princesses, the undead, automatons, and history's greatest musicians. Or history's greatest musician, which would be a reference to, Parappa the Rapper, Sir Daniel Fortescue, Sly Cooper, Fat Princess. This is very clearly a PS All-Stars reference, and Kratos, I guess, responds in that monotone, type of way where he says, I would not speak of this. Pretty much shutting down the possibility of, directly talking about it, but I don't know about you, this sounds to me like PlayStation All-Stars is now canon to Kratos' story. He at one point went there and fought people. We don't know if if his victory is canon, but that was just weird. I read that and I'm like, really? They acknowledged PS All-Stars in this game? Oh yeah, it looks like they did. So Kratos and PS All-Stars, that's canon. Anyway, going back to sales data, this time for PS5 consoles. We've mentioned recently that the stock is finally improving in a massive way, confirmed via Sony's recent financial report where their forecasts are unchanged, meaning that they expect to sell a lot of consoles, which is good. And we saw for the US MPD in August and September, PS5 was number one. They also outsold Switch for at least 1 week in Japan recently. And so now they are again confirmed via Matt Piscatella for the MPD report of October. PS5 number one again, most sold consoles, number one in units and dollar sales. So we're finally seeing, PS5 demand be reached, because the console can actually sit in stock for hours at a time, days at a time. Standard consoles, the digital console, which is the most low volume machine, we're talking standard digital edition PS5s, can sit in stock for a bit now, so we're almost there. Still not a walk into a store and buy one kind of thing. That's going to be highly dependent on the store, of course, but yeah, it's about to get wild. So we'll finally start seeing Sony really do the numbers that they were always expecting to do. Now, moving on to PSVR 2. This past week, they finally opened up pre-orders, and if you're in a country that has PlayStation Direct, then that's the only way you can order. And that was based on an email invite system, which we talked about, right? So it seems like most people that wanted a PSVR 2 were able to get one. That sounds anecdotal, but just from what I'm seeing, it seems like it was a much easier process. So for me personally, I signed up 2 accounts. They both got emails just fine on Monday, which was, it seemed like that was very last minute, but they both got emails, ordered mine just fine. I just checked my second account just to see. So right now it's obviously going into Friday morning for me, and that account can still pre-order a PSVR 2. So much easier process if you did not get an email, as in you had no option of even trying to order one. I think they're going to get to a point where they'll do open orders for this thing, so that might be in small batches where if you just visit PS Direct, normally it's going to have a queue or something. As always, follow Wari64 on Twitter, as long as Twitter is still upright, but you could do that just in case. But I think it's going to be fairly easy to secure one, and if you're outside of a country that does not have PS Direct, then local retailers, of course, were opening up pre-orders as well, and that might be a whole different can of worms. Not sure how easy or not easy that will be, but I think PSVR 2 stock is going to be generally okay, just based on this being a bit more niche, and assuming the launch lineup isn't that great, then that might detract some people from buying it day one. But speaking of the launch lineup, we can bring that up as our next story, because we do have a good idea of how many games are, or what games are going to be available at launch. So that list that Sony published on the PS blog wasn't too far off base, where I mentioned they were all launch titles. Some are, and That's based on the new PlayStation Store listing where all these games are now available on PSN to pre-order. So in terms of actual launch games with their prices, we've got Horizon Call of the Mountain, that's $59.99. Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge, that's $49.99. Demio is $39.99, but some of these do have a PS Plus discount where you can lock in a lower price if you pre-order before launch, so keep that in mind. There's Cities VR, $29.99, the standard price. Cosmonious High, $29.99. Zenith, The Last City, $29.99. The Light Brigade, $24.99. Tentacular, $24.99. Hello Neighbor Search and Rescue, $29.99. The Dark Picture Switchback VR, no price on that one. And also on launch day, it is confirmed, it's not on this pre-order page, but No Man's Sky's free PS VR2 upgrade is going to be day one. So altogether, we've got 11 launch games so far, and we do know that total is supposed to be 20, around 20, somewhere in that ballpark, which I'm sure that final number is subject to change. So at least right now, we can, I think, safely say that the launch lineup is looking... it's underwhelming, right? It's there's not much there that really stands out outside of Horizon, which I'm sure that is going to be a visual showpiece, a fantastic, VR adventure to go through, which, keep in mind, it is a, like 6 to 8 hour game, which that's a lot in VR, but it's not going to be a, 50, 60 hour Horizon game. And of course, it's going to be, it's priced a bit on the higher side, which... Always remember, it's not going to stay that price forever, but if you want that game, better to grab it through the Horizon bundle where it's $10 cheaper overall. But yeah, the launch lineup, even though we don't have the full thing, I can't see it like greatly improving from here, just only because if you have something big to say this close to launch, you probably would have said it by now. So if, say, Half-Life Alyx is coming, that's great, but it seems like it would not be a launch title at this point, so I don't know if we're going to see it improve much from beyond what we're seeing right now. So it would be more in the underwhelming category, and that's not exactly how you want to launch this thing, but it's always, it's about what you do over time, so plenty of consoles have bad launches, and all the good stuff comes eventually. It's really about what Sony does and says within that first 1 to 2 years, which really dictates the amount of support and how much they care about this thing, which the first headset they did pretty well. I mean, that thing saw a lot of support over time, so if it's the same here, then we should see some compelling stuff, and with Sony courting in other developers, hopefully a lot of software comes from the small to the big. Now let's move on to Jeff Keighley's The Game Awards, which are airing on December 8th, and recently the nominees were revealed, and that's where we saw, and this happens often because SIE puts out, good games, so they earned a lot of nominations across various categories, so let's talk about some of them. Namely, that would be Best Game Direction, that has God of War, Horizon, also Stray in there, that's really cool. Best Narrative, God of War, and Horizon. For Best Audio Design, that has God of War, Horizon, also Gran Turismo 7. Makes a lot of sense on that one. And for Best Performance, Ashley Birch as Aloy, Christopher Judge as Kratos, and Sonny Soljic as Atreus. For Best Indie, there's nothing in here directly that's SIE, obviously, but man, these are all fantastic nominees. I love all these games. Stray, obviously, I lean towards, but those are all so good. And then Innovation and Accessibility, The Last of Us Part 1 makes a lot of sense. Also Ragnarök now in there with a wide range of options. And going into action-adventure games, again, Ragnarök, Horizon, Stray. And then Best Adaptation, interestingly, Uncharted made it in there. Well, I guess that's not too surprising, but I do feel like this is really a race between Edgerunners and Arcane, so I can't see Uncharted having any hope of winning that category, but the big one here is the Game of the Year, so the nominees are A Plague Tale Requiem, Elden Ring, God of War Ragnarök, Horizon Forbidden West, Stray, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. So, what did I say multiple times this year, across different videos, mind you? Stray, Game of the Year, upcoming Cat Game, Game of the Year, 2022, Stray, dropping on PS Plus Extra, Game of the Year, physical copy coming out, buy it, not Ragnarök, Game of the Year. it actually happened. And in fairness, did I think that would happen? No. I didn't really think it would be. I didn't really think this would happen. But I'm here for it, right? And that's the disappointing thing, is that of course, like, that was the one game that really stood out to people of like, why is Stray on there? It should be something else. And while I'm not going to endorse the Stray slander, I do see where people are coming from, that Stray could have not been there in place of something else. But I am wholeheartedly happy to see it on there. These games are voted in by a panel, and you can always vote, of course. And like I mentioned beforehand, it's like there's multiple sites that have Game of the Year awards, so it's not like we have to hone in on one category and one place that does this. So that's why I often don't like these discussions, because they tend to kind of downplay games and bicker and argue, and that's never fun, but that also happens all the time. And the same thing with like Forbidden West, oddly enough. I don't know, maybe I'm off base and a lot of people are not liking the game nearly as much, but I felt like it was a fantastic game. I mean, it's building upon Zero Dawn in nearly every way. So for me, that 70, 80 hour playthrough just flew by. I loved it. I do admit it's the starting point, like the intro's kind of slow with that tutorial and trying to get out of the daunt, but I felt like the story was a lot more, not a lot more, but surprising and intriguing in a way where I didn't know how they would take it after the big surprise reveal in Zero Dawn. The combat was evolved to be a lot more tight and also inventive in terms of how you can approach combat. I just feel like Forbidden West absolutely is a big game from this year that deserves some recognition. But having said that, when you're talking about a game of the year situation, it's normally what we see in previous years, where you've got one or two games that really stand out in a significant way. And across various sites, generally there's going to be one or two that get the most awards. And then you've got this kind of runoff effect where, Horizon might get one here and there, right? Or Xenoblade or something else. Like, it could be certainly spread out, but the two games that I think are going to really pick up the most awards across various places, it is Elden Ring and Ragnarök. So I think that's what it really comes down to. But if I could promote some kind of positive conversation here, don't always, fixate on what shouldn't be there or what doesn't deserve the award. It's really about celebrating some games that stand out amongst the rest, and we can do that without downplaying the other ones. Now, moving on to our latest update in the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard, we have two very big updates here. So a few days ago, we had Ricardo Cardoso, the deputy head of Unit Interinstitutional and Outreach. He sent out this tweet where he says, and I quote, "The Commission is working to ensure that you will still be able to play Call of Duty on other consoles, including my PlayStation." The EU Commission responded to this in a statement sent to Tweaktown, where they say this individual is not involved in the process and that they oftentimes can tweet in a personal capacity. And Cardoso then clarified his statements in another tweet where they say they are not involved in the merger and they don't actually work in the same department. And this was clearly a problem, right? You don't want to say this. It looks really bad, right? Not only because they're saying my PlayStation, which infers a certain level of bias, which really that on its own seems a bit innocent, and I would argue that you've got people that are, the entire process is largely professional, and it's not going to really boil down to like console war stuff. Like, that seems like a big stretch, although certainly a possibility. The real issue with the tweet is that he's kind of already saying like what the end result is going to be. Like, the entire regulatory process has never necessarily been about ensuring the games stay multi-platform. It's just about seeing if there's going to be any sort of major anti-competitive outcomes, right? And so, like, Brazil identified and even called out Sony, saying that, it's not their responsibility to protect Sony's interests. And that's true to a degree, which, looking at the CMA, where they mentioned how this would affect Sony, because they have to look at the current market and how it would shift. And this seems to be lost on people, but you kind of do have to look at Sony to some degree, because there's only 3 console manufacturers. So I don't know how you analyze, how this deal could affect the market without considering Sony. Like, you kind of have to do that. But it's not necessarily about ensuring the games stay multi-platform. The EU could very easily look at this deal and come to the conclusion that no concessions have to be made, and Microsoft can do whatever they want with Call of Duty, right? So it's not necessarily about picking a side immediately, which, just to clarify, like, the reason why we always cover these stories is because not only is it really fascinating to see this play out, because we've never had a deal like this, but it does have some PlayStation implications, obviously, and this is Let's Talk PlayStation. But just to reconfirm where I sit, I'm not picking a side. I'm fairly neutral on this whole thing. It's just a matter of, there's pros and cons to both outcomes, where it's approved and not approved. So I'm not coming from a place where I really want one outcome over the other. It's just, fascinating to see this play out, and to have this situation pop up. It's just been so weird, and, you don't really want that to be out there. It might be a personal account, but you still, to a degree, represent the organization. It's not like Adam Orth back in 2014 can just, no, it was 2013, because it was before X1 launched. You don't want Adam Orth to just be able to say, oh, everyone has internet, like, get over it, right? That whole Xbox One Microsoft thing, if you remember that, right? So you can't sit behind the personal opinion thing. You have to be professional to a degree. So that didn't really look all that good. But the other big part of what happened this past week was the Microsoft CEO of gaming, Phil Spencer, on the Decoder podcast with The Verge's Nilay Patel. And that's where he gave a very clear, direct answer on what's going to happen with Call of Duty. It's very obvious. It seems like he's kind of getting exhausted answering this, but he says, and I quote, "It's not about at some point I pull the rug underneath PlayStation 7's legs and it's, aha, you just didn't write the contract long enough. This idea that we would write a contract that says the word forever in it, I think, is a little bit silly, but to make a longer-term commitment that Sony would be comfortable with, that regulators would be comfortable with, I have no issue with at all." And to really clarify this, he says, "We think Call of Duty will be on PlayStation as long as players want to play Call of Duty on PlayStation, and that's not a competitive threat against PlayStation, that's just a pragmatic way of looking at it." And then when Nilay brings up game streaming, Spencer immediately clarifies native Call of Duty on PlayStation, not linked to them having to carry Game Pass, not streaming. If they want a streaming version of Call of Duty, we could do that as well, just like we do on our own consoles. There's nothing behind my back. The next game, the next game, native on the platform, not having to subscribe to Game Pass. Sony does not have to take Game Pass on their platform to make that happen. He says a few more things after that, but, thus far, that's been the most clear-cut, black and white, direct, long answer that he's given. And they've been, pretty clear most of the time, but we do have to remember early on it was intent, then conversations with Sony, then that debacle came up of we offered several more years. Sony then, came out and said, no, it was actually 3, so that brings up the question, why 3 and not, somehow a bit longer? We can't expect perpetuity per se, but, why can't there be a longer commitment? Then the CMA, published their, initial phase 1 documents, which clearly showed, it's all fact that they've got internal documents looking at a foreclosure strategy. They consider Sony a competitor, and so it's something where we never know what their intent truly is behind the scenes. They would not pick up Activision Blizzard if there wasn't, a ton of upside, which would include the Call of Duty property. And yes, there is another angle of it for Microsoft where King Digital Entertainment is a big one. They want, a foothold in the mobile space, which is what they've been talking about. So that is a big part of the deal. There's no doubt about it. Just in the context of the console, Call of Duty IP situation, of course they can't promise, and really why would they want to, because they still want to have some kind of leverage. I don't want to like have to paint Phil as this bad guy. I think he's, you know, got a tough job, and he's trying to work with regulators the best that he can to make sure the deal goes through. And you don't really want to say all these things on day one. And I think that's really what's happening here, because there is a difference between what was said on day one versus today. And that New York Post report, which if it's true, then it seems like there is a certain level of doubt within Activision and Microsoft that the deal may not go through, right? Or that they have to make concessions they don't want to, because then they're losing the upside of the deal. Those things can still very much be true behind the scenes, despite Phil Spencer, you know, saying we'll keep making the game for PlayStation 7, which is certainly awesome to hear. But those are Phil's words, and because it will never be, you know, in a contract on paper, right? Like that's not guaranteed. You know, Phil Spencer may not be leading Xbox by PlayStation 7, and we know how corporate turnover can lead to dramatically different strategies. So I think Call of Duty is really never safe unless some kind of long-term commitment is made. So forever, you know, obviously might not make sense, but I'm sure Sony at the very minimum would love to have something that says 10 plus, 15 plus years. That seems crazy for the games business, but there are contracts that go that long. It's so complicated still. But what I will say is that, you know, so far I think they are certainly trying to be more forthcoming on, you know, in the short to mid-term, definitely promise those native games beyond Sony's original agreement, which for Sony at least is probably the best case scenario, considering we still all expect the deal will go through. Anyway, moving on to a brief update for a PlayStation Productions project. This one, the Gran Turismo movie, where it's confirmed from the movie's official Twitter account and also the Sony Pictures Twitter account that principal photography has kicked off, so they are officially filming this movie. And that's wild to see because, well, this is another video game IP that has been in limbo for years, trying to get some kind of movie or project off the ground. And again, this one is based on Jan Mardenborough, who had you know, played the games and eventually grew up to win real-life Gran Turismo competitions, really driving cars. So that will be what this movie is based on. We also learned that Ginger Spice is going to be in here, which is also kind of weird, but yeah, Gran Turismo movie. I'm sure we'll see this sometime next year. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories that I wanted to talk about with you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was actually on Wednesday, which was the 2-year PS5 review. So we'll do that every year, but you know, we're looking at how Sony's done thus far, and more specifically looking at the last year when it comes to games, UI, things like that. So if you didn't see, go check that out. And as always, another video on Tuesday, but until then, that is it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.